Hi, this is Misha, and in my top 6 favorite AKs video, I said I was going to leave out the RPKs because that's not really fair. I am a big fan of the RPK, as anyone who's watched this channel much knows. And in that spirit, I decided to kind of revisit the history and talk about some variants. I know it's a little bit of a retread, folks, but actually, I think every gun on the table now is technically a different gun than was in the original video from a year ago, as I've upgraded and changed, and that we could really kind of talk about it again. So, in that vein, we've got a 1961 RPK Standard Rifle, 7.62-39. Slings. Then we have an RPK S, as you see, side folder, also in 7.62-39. This is dated 1971, at least the kit. These are both Legion assembled guns from original parts sets. Followed by an RPK-74. This is a 1988 kit assembled by Vector. And finally, to wrap up the series, we will be ending with a sling hung on the end of the table. There we go. An Rpk-74 M, as you see, a folder again. And this is the one import on the table from Russia, which is dated 2016. So the history of the RPK. In some ways, the RPK is often a little misunderstood. It is decidedly an overgrown Kalashnikov, no doubt about that. But it's more. In World War II, 1944-1945, the program based around 7.62-39 was begun. The idea was to have a bolt-action rifle chambered for it, which never really went past the prototype stage because of obvious reasons. A self-loading infantry carbine, which became the SKS. A select fire assault rifle / kind of submachine gun, which became the AK. And a handheld light machine gun, which became the RPD. So the RPD was Russia's light machine gun through the 40s, and really into the 50s it became prevalent. But already by 1955, which is when the AK Type 3, so the final milled version, was well into production, they wanted something to replace the RPD. The RPD had several flaws, shortcomings. It had a fixed barrel. It was relatively heavy. It was about 16 pounds. It was belt fed, which on the one hand gave it a large capacity, usually 100 rounds, but you could link belts together for more. But unfortunately, the 7.62-39 cartridge was just barely powerful enough to cycle a belt fed machine gun. Now, luckily, the RPD did have an adjustable gas system, so this helped some. But the RPD, on top of all that, was relatively expensive to mass produce by the standards of the 50s, and it of course shared virtually no parts at all in common with the Kalashnikov, the AK, which was standard issue in Russia at the time. So by the mid-50s they said, we want a new light machine gun, cheaper, faster to produce, lighter weight, still chambered for 7.62-39. And oh, if it happened to use some of the same bits and pieces and maybe magazines as the AK, that'd be swell. And that is where the RPK's story begins. Stop there. At the same time, in the late 50s, work was commencing on what would become the AKM, and this would ultimately replace the AK Type 3 in Russian military service. The AKM was primarily developed at Izhevsk, with Kalashnikov kind of spearheading the team, although not as directly involved as he had been a decade earlier. The main things, the driving factors with the AKM, it went to a stamped receiver, or back to a stamped receiver. It went to a lighter weight barrel, different profile to the furniture, added some lightning cuts here and there. They were basically going for a cheaper, faster, easier to mass produce gun. Also one that was a little more controllable in full auto, while at the same time being lighter weight. And of course not sacrificing any durability, reliability, so on and so forth. As kind of a secondary concern, they developed the RPK, which was Kalashnikov's handheld machine gun, basically light machine gun. It was a step or two behind the AKM. The AKM was adopted in 1959, and a lot of sources claim the RPK was as well. I'm not sure about that, but I can tell you work was still underway on this weapon in 1960 at Izhevsk. Once they more or less had the design ironed out, they would actually transfer production over in 1961, or maybe late 1960, but it would be up and running in 1961 at the factory we know today as Molot. And that's where Molot would take over light machine gun production and really become very well known, associated with the RPK. Previously, they had been set up during World War II to make submachine guns and also aircraft cannons and other larger pieces of equipment. So they had experience with the larger scale machine gun type stuff as well as submachine guns. They were a good fit. The reason Izhevsk did not ultimately build the RPK was they just didn't have the production capacity. They were busy with the AKM and other projects, so they transferred it over to Molot, which was actually nearby, so Izhevsk could give support. And in the early days, they absolutely did. So just to go over the specs briefly, I know you can look these up. Overall, we're at about 40.5 inches. We've got a 23.25 inch heavy walled barrel, chrome lined. As you see, we've got a folding light bipod made out of stamped steel. No bayonet lug, because where would it go? We do have 14mm muzzle threads, but early on they pretty much just put a muzzle nut on there. The threads are just there in case or for a blank fire adapter. Because of the heavier barrel, we have a thicker lower handguard, but our upper is the same, and we have the same length of gas system as on an AKM. The rear sight is similar to an AKM, but we have this additional windage adjustment knob, as well as standard elevation. The receiver was like an AKM, but thicker. The AKM was 1.0 millimeters. The RPK was 1.5. It was also a little bit longer. They retained the milled, machined recoil spring guide from the original AK, as opposed to the wire stamped type featured in the AKM, just for durability. And they went to a paddle buttstock, pretty much copied from the RPD. The RPK could definitely feed from standard 30-round AK mags, but it was issued with a 75-round drum, which we have here. the top loader. This is a Russian drum and a Russian pouch. Usually one of these was issued with the gun, and then a pouch of 40 round mags. Usually one pouch of 4, sometimes 2 pouches of 4 were issued. These were made at the same pattern as the 30 round, just longer. Steel mags with the ribbing. As reliable as anything else. The drum was handy because it didn't interfere with the gun getting too low, and it had extra capacity, but it was obviously much slower to load and use, and other kind of failings of drums. Early on, the first RPKs had a few unique features. Like I said, this is a 1961 kit assembled by Legion USA using a Nodak Spud India 7 receiver. Has the proper pad RPK sling, all that. You'll notice it has the ribbed top cover. That's because the early RPKs actually were built with the ribbed top covers. They would use these for a couple of years. Many speculate these top covers were actually supplied to Molot by Izhevsk. It's very possible. You'll also notice this has magwell dimples. Now these are the Nodak Spud receivers, but this is correct for an early Russian gun. For about the first 10 years of production, they would have a dimpled magwell. Later they would go to the slab side we're more familiar with, and instead of having dimples, they would just simply weld plates in. Many think dimples on an AK are there to keep the mag from moving, or they can sometimes serve the secondary function. It's actually there to reinforce the stamped steel, because there's no rivets in this area and you have mags going in and out, so it was always perceived as a potential place where the receiver could warp. So by bending and dimpling the steel, you actually strengthen it. The same thing with the top cover. We have the bulge, of course, for the heavy front trunnion. Another feature of the early guns, they would have the wood pistol grips for a couple of years. Kind of interesting. And like early AKMs, they would have a bolt carrier without the lightning cut, the step behind the cocking handle. Again, like I said, early AKMs would have this slab-sided carrier as well. Now, interesting, the bolt has the fluting, the lightning cuts. So that was the kind of the early RPKs. Molot would put these into production in 1961, which is really when they were officially adopted, or at least appear to be so. They would start to appear in noticeable numbers in the field in 1964, and they were seen quite predominantly in the May Day parade of 1966, by which time the Soviet Red Army was issuing one of these per squad, so quite a large scale, really. Certainly for a light machine gun type weapon. Now, this did have the same kind of failing as the RPD, that it has a fixed barrel, so it's pinned into the receiver, same as on an AKM. However, one thing they really were able to address, as I said, the RPD was 16 pounds. The RPK was 10.5 pounds unloaded, so 2 kilograms, 5.5 pounds, and it really shows. So even though we still have a fixed barrel, we have a much lighter, more easily portable, easy to carry gun. And they trained soldiers to basically use these in short bursts to keep them from overheating. And they were much cheaper, faster to produce because of the stamped receiver instead of the milled receiver of the RPD. So they achieved most of their goals. And of course they had the PKM medium and heavy machine guns for such use. To go along with the RPK is the other guy on the table right now. Boop. We have the Rpk S Side Holder, intended for paratroops. I've actually got it here with a, I'm gonna try to get this out of our way. How about I take that drum out? How about that? Seems like that'll make life a lot easier for this vid. There we go. Have the drop case here. It's kind of interesting. Anyone who knows the Soviet stuff, it's just larger for the paratrooper. Here we go. The front end is the same for the RPKS, exactly the same. The difference is in the back with our folding stock. I'm going to turn this around to show you. There is a release in the back here. You just make sure I don't set my legs on something I don't want to. Come on. You just do the release and your stock swings out and locks in. I can actually feel where I'm going here. There we go. This is what I was saying about the 40 round mags. They kind of make the gun monopod if you try to just rest it on the table. Now when you have it up in more of a firing position, it's not a problem. I'm going to actually pull this off so I don't have to hold it the whole time. Like I said, this is the front. This folds. Now interestingly, there's not a release except you use a bullet tip in this hole here to fold it over. That's because this was intended for use as a machine gun by paratroopers. So getting the stock in place quickly was a priority, and they definitely did not want it folding during use in the field. So that's why they actually kind of made a lock with frankly a bullet button. So California, they beat you to the bullet button for folding stock though. This is a later example from 1971. It has the more familiar smooth top cover, which is thicker steel. It's about 50% thicker. It's more like the heavier top cover you see on the original AK Type 3 series. You can see the lightning cut in the bolt carrier now disappeared in the mid-60s. And we've gone to a synthetic pistol grip. Molot's pistol grips are interesting because they have the concave inverted checkering. And this has the pretty well known and popular double hook, double D-ring sling, which was really made famous during Russia's invasion of Afghanistan. Now the mag I had in it is another 40 rounder. This is made out of AG4, a type of fiberglass with metal reinforcements like on the locking lugs, the floor plate, the frame as needed. These actually came into use around 1968. A lot of people identify the AG4 or the Bakelite, as it's often known, mags with the Rpk-74, but actually they were used in 30 round versions for the AKM, and as you see here, the 40 round versions for the RPK beginning in the late 60s and would stay in use through the 70s. And they would slowly phase out, and drums would still be issued, but less and less, because these were lighter. They didn't rust, they didn't dent. If you dropped one, it was either fine or it was basically shattered. So you knew if a mag was good or not. And of course, they were cheaper, easier to mass produce. And that was the RPK S for paratroopers. Again, the only real difference is the folding stock and all that kind of goes with it. This mechanism, it's an internal hinge. It added a little bit of weight to the gun, about 1/3 of a pound. So we're closer to 11 pounds with this critter. And of course, they would make these in much smaller numbers, but they would make them. This video is really on the Russian RPK, but I would be remiss if I didn't add that while a lot of nations used the RPK, not that many manufactured it to Russian spec outside of the Soviet Union. One such nation was Romania with the PM64. Another, and obviously that came into use in 1964, another was Bulgaria, who began to manufacture a version in 1971. Interestingly, Bulgaria would build their RPKs on a milled receiver. Now, Yugoslavia would have the M72, which people often consider to be an RPK, but like most things made by Zastava, it really wasn't. It was inspired by the RPK, but it very much did its own thing. So the M72 is kind of its own thing, as are the various Chinese guns that people often call RPKs, as well as the Finnish Valmet M78, again, very much its own thing. So really true RPKs were only really manufactured in Russia, Bulgaria, and Romania. If I'm missing one, sorry folks, but that's the ones that come to mind at this time. But they were purchased in quite large numbers by several nations allied with Russia, and they were very popular in 7.6239. It was a simple, rugged, dependable, and quite lethal at medium ranges. It extended, it was a little accurate, a little more out than a standard AKM, but it could still take a lot of the same parts as the AKM, especially your small parts like bits of your trigger group, your firing pin, extractor, all the little bits that tend to wear out or break or go missing on a rifle. Those are shared. Now, of course, the larger components like the barrel hardware, the furniture, so on and so forth, were not, but the things that would potentially wear out were. So that was very much a help. We'll move on. And moving on, we have the Rpk-74. No surprise, this is a version of the RPK chambered for 5.45 by 39, and much like with the AKM and 7.6239, when the AK-74 was first on paper adopted in 1974, and then really started to be fielded around 1976-77, an RPK version to complement it was also introduced. But really not that many changes were made to the design except the caliber. I'm going to take this mag out because this one really likes to monopod. It's even longer, so we'll start with the mag. Initially, this one's fit tight too, of course. I need to work on this mag well. It's a tight one. Let me get here in the right angle, guys. Initially, the RPK-74 would use magazines made out of the same fiberglass AG4 material as the later RPK mags. The only real difference, aside from of course being in the smaller cartridge, they would hold 45 rounds instead of 40. And they would be kept in a similar 4-cell pouch. The first pouch you looked at with the other gun had the front pocket. It was actually a Romanian pouch, although Russia had a pocket version too. But they would do this version without a pocket also. Originally, the RPK-74 would have the same wood furniture, but soon, in the 1980s, we would go to the synthetic. We'll revisit that in just a minute, but just to look, we're just a smidgen longer. We're at about 41 to 41 and a half inches because we have this birdcage flash hider. It's still on 14x1 left-hand threads. It's a 5-slot hider, unique to the RPK. Barrel is still 23¼ inches. The bipod was updated just a little bit up here on the collar to give a little more rotation, but basically it's the same. Same with the gas system and all that. We still have the windage adjustable. We still have the thicker top cover. Still have the lightning cut carrier. We do have one internal difference. We're still using the machined guide rod, but we've gone to a braided spring with the 74. And we've added a couple of little tabs in the back here of the guide, also the little dimple on the top, which is pretty similar to what you'll see on later AK-74s. As you see, this receiver does not have the magwell dimple. Instead, there's plates inside. This is a Nodak NDS-8 receiver. In the early 80s, we would start to kind of go to a shiny plum pistol grip for both the AK-74 and then the RPK-74. And beginning around 85, running through the later 80s, the so-called plum furniture would start to replace the wood. And along with that, plum magazines for the RPK would come into use. I don't have any of those. Apologies, folks. They are quite pricey. But you'll see more and more synthetics come in for this gun. Flip it around. A number of these would be used by Russia during the invasion of Afghanistan. They would also do an Rpk S 74, which is identical to this, except it would have the side folding stock like you saw in the Rpk S, folding to the left. They would also have a scope rail as an optional version, an optional upgrade known as the Rpk N 74. This would not be standard, but it would be an option. And they would start to use more cast parts, just like on the AK-74. For example, the handguard retainer could start to be cast, although since the RPK was meant to be a light machine gun, it would still retain a majority of machined parts, unlike the AK-74. These would still be manufactured by the factory we know as Molot, and not a whole lot would change. Whereas a lot of nations use the RPK in 76239, not many adopted the Rpk-74 in 545 by 39. This is because the cartridge came in very late during the communist era, and there just wasn't time and there wasn't interest. The nations that were still loyal to Russia in the 80s mostly kept using the RPK, even if they went to a gun in 545. There were a couple of exceptions. Bulgaria, for example, adopted the Rpk-74 in 1985. And this kit actually is out of Bulgaria. However, most of the Bulgarian Rpk-74s were actually assembled from Russian parts, if weren't just bought whole cloth as rifles from Russia. So a lot of times the virgin parts would be sent over originally made by Molot, but assembled by Arsenal AD Circle 10 in Bulgaria. Romania would actually adopt a version of their PM64 known as the PM93, chambered for 545, but very, very late in life, and it would deviate quite a bit from this design because it wasn't really based on the RPK74, but rather the original RPK. It may not seem like a big difference, but you know, the details are quite different. Romania started to really do its own thing as well. And that brings us to the final rifle today. The Rpk-74 M, which is basically the improved version here, and which is still standard in the Russian Federation to this very day. So guys, let me get a little room here. At first, you may not see a major difference from the original RPK-74, but there, again, the devil's kind of in the details. We have the folding stock, which has become standard with the 74M. And whereas before, at least earlier on, you had to use this hole to fold it, we finally added a latch so you can do it by hand. So this is over here, little latch, so you can easily, more quickly fold it. We've also updated the scope rail, modernized it a bit, also streamlined it for a little mass production. And this is now a standard feature, not just optional. Now, a lot of the other changes kind of were concurrent or came slightly after they were added to the AK-74, which became the AK-74M beginning around 1991. First and foremost, we have the furniture. We've gone from the plum to what most would call true black. It's not just a different color, but it is also a new mix of polyamide, more of a modernized polymer. And this would come in the early 90s to go along with it. They would go from the plum and earlier Bakelite mags to 45 round true black mags. One thing that's interesting to me, they call these Waffle Mags. They're not waffle, the lines are horizontal. Not waffle at all. This is also made from the newer polymer, still reinforced. To kind of complete our walk through the furniture, this one has the most modern, up-to-date Molot ergonomic grip. This is a relatively recent grip that's only been used maybe the last 10 years. Before that, they would just have a true black inverted checkered grip, which is probably more common, but newer ones would have this. Everything is the same, lengthwise, weight-wise. We have gone to a slightly different pattern of birdcage flash hider, still on 14mm threads. It just has slightly thinner walls, it's a little bit lighter. Also like and I've got this positioned on the wrong side, of course I do. like with the late AK-74s and the AK-74 M, the trigger guard has a little dimple here. It's kind of a manufacturing artifact. I'm going to flip it back around now because what I want to show you next is inside. The dust cover, the receiver, pretty much exactly the same. But we've gone back to a more standard coil spring with closer together coils. I'm sure this was a manufacturing thing. It also might be a little more durable. I'm not really sure what the rationale there was. And much like with the AK-74 to AK-74 M, in the late 80s, the flutes around the head of the gas piston disappeared. And also the machining on the bolt carrier was kind of streamlined a bit. I know it won't show up on camera, so no reason to even worry about it. One other thing, the bolt here has a spring-loaded firing pin. You see it's kind of the small head type. I'm not sure if that's something done for just a semi-auto in the VEPR series that Molot did, or if the Rpk-74 M military guns have the spring-loaded, because all previous RPKs just had your typical AK free-floated firing pin. So the carrier is a little different, but not a whole lot. One other thing, just to kind of clear up, is the left side, the so-called bump rivet, or second rivet on the side. If you have an SGL, either AK-74 M, you'll expect to see it here. Also, some VEPRs and even my old VEPR 1V had it here. And what that rivet was for was to help the bolt turn, and it was a bearing surface for the bolt. After looking into it and talking with some knowledgeable people online, it seems like the military Rpk-74Ms do not in fact have that second rivet here that helps the bolt. It seems like it's something mostly done on commercial guns or sporter guns. Not really sure what the whole reasoning why some have it, some don't, but it does seem like the military guns do not have that rivet there, so it being missing is perfectly correct. There we go. This fits a little tight. And this is the version. I'm not exactly sure the year, and probably all these changes did not happen at once, but definitely by the mid-90s, the Rpk-74 M was being picked up by the Russian military, now post-Soviet Union, and replacing older guns that were worn out. That said, the original Rpk-74 and Rpk S 74 are still officially in service, because really the differences are pretty minor and just cosmetic. A few minor updates like the scope rail might be useful, but mostly just, you know, production shortcuts and modernizations as needed. And of course you can install the newer furniture on older guns when the wood or plumb wears out. So it seems like these are only brought in as needed, and of course still kind of issuing one per squad. And Russia, Molot I should say, does offer a few versions. There's this, of course, the Rpk-74 M at 545x39. There is the Rpk-201, Rpk-201, which is in 556 NATO, which is offered for export and has been adopted by the mighty military of the island of Fiji. And there's also the Rpk-203, also known as Rpk M, which is the same gun, but chambered for 7.6239. So it has all the updates, folding stock, modern furniture, but it's in the original caliber. And this has been exported to a few nations, and I think a handful may be in service with Russia in some capacity, but hard to say. It's actually very hard to get info on the RPK. And there you have it, kind of from this being, like I said, a 2016 all the way back to 1961, first year production. That is kind of the history and a few variants of the RPK Kalashnikov's handheld light machine gun. If you have any questions or comments, we'd welcome them below. If you liked the video, we'd appreciate it if you would click like, and also if you would check out some of our other videos. We have a number on the RPK. Like I said, this is a little bit of a rehash, but I felt like doing it. I like my RPKs and just felt like a good day to talk about them. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to our Patreon page. This is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.